The warnings they ignored. They didn't listen. That was what haunted Kale more than anything else. Long after the last signal from Earth fell silent, long after the cities crumbled and the stars themselves seemed to turn their backs, the truth remained. They were warned. Standing now in the skeletal ruins of Outpost K-17 on Europa, wrapped in a ragged survival suit and staring across an endless white desert, Kale remembered. The warnings had come from everywhere, broadcasted on every known frequency, drawn in the fading light patterns of dead stars, whispered in the dreams of the few explorers who dared venture beyond Sector 19 into the territories they had marked dead space. The messages weren't threats. They weren't even demands. They were simple, desperate pleas. Do not come here. But Earth didn't listen. In the steel towers of Earth GV, in the council chambers of the lunar colonies, in the gleaming boardrooms orbiting Mars, they laughed. They called it cosmic noise. Primitive signals, static from dying systems. Kyle had been there, just a systems engineer. Then not important enough to make decisions, but close enough to hear the echo of their contempt. Close enough to watch the policymakers and tech magnates wave off the growing concern like a nuisance. They called it the whisper net. At first, just faint static patterns filtering through long-range sensors easy to dismiss. Then the patterns formed into repeating sequences, then into a structure, a language no AI could decode, but which made human researchers wake up screaming, clutching their heads, their dreams invaded by visions of burning stars, broken planets, and voices that spoke without sound. Still, humanity pressed forward. Frontier colonies desperate for new resources, and fame ignored the growing list of vanished science vessels. A handful of missing freighters were dismissed as pirate raids or navigation failures, equipment malfunction, anything but what the whispering signals had warned of. Do not cross the veil, they had said. We buried them there, we died to trap them. But humanity believed it was invincible. Kale remembered the televised debates. They were called forums, but they were little more than ego contests. Politicians salivated at the thought of first claims to new systems. Corporate executives drooled over potential new technologies. Military leaders saw the frontier as a place to test new weapons and the scientists. The few who pleaded for caution were mocked, ridiculed, and cut off from funding. Greed shouted louder than reason. By the time the first real signs of danger appeared, it was too late. Some said the universe would die, a slow, cold death. Billions of years from now, they were wrong. Death had been waiting dormant, trapped beyond the veil, and humanity in its arrogance tore open the gate. Kale still remembered the day it happened. It started with minor anomalies, communications lagged, star charts began to shift. Not by much, just a fraction enough that navigators had to recheck their routes manually. AIs tasked with deep space exploration started glitching, giving impossible readings, conflicting data about mass temperature, distance. Scientists blamed faulty sensors. Engineers blamed cosmic interference. Nobody blamed the whispers. And then the nightmares became universal. Entire crews were found dead, not from violence but from suicide. Whole ships floating through space, filled with corpses whose last expressions were twisted in horror. Entire settlements fell silent overnight. The signals grew louder, less pleading, and more urgent. You were warned. Still, humanity did not stop. Earth's leaders, bloated with pride, celebrated their resilience. They called it a new age of expansion. The truth was they were running headlong into their extinction, and they celebrated it as progress. Standing there in the cold winds of Europa, Kale clenched his fists against the frost seeping into his gloves. He could still hear the echoes of laughter in his memory, the way they dismissed the signals, the way they dismissed the people who tried to sound the alarm. They hadn't listened, and so they died. The rift opened. It wasn't war. It wasn't an invasion. When the rift finally tore open the fabric of known space, humanity stood proud and unafraid. They had fought plagues, conquered planets, built floating cities among the stars. They had defied nature itself. Whatever lay beyond that shimmering terror would be just another obstacle to dominate, another trophy to claim. That arrogance was mistake number 3. The rift was nothing like a wormhole. It didn't shimmer with the blue hues of ionized gas, didn't hum with the promise of shortcuts across the galaxy. It bled. Light bent unnaturally around it, signals warped and twisted. Ships that strayed too close came back wrong, if they came back at all. Kale remembered watching the first footage transmitted back from the Pioneer fleets. He remembered how the stars around the rift seemed to smear and bend, how the darkness inside wasn't empty, but too full. like something immense and patient was pressing against the skin of reality, waiting for the right tear to slip through. And slip through it did. It didn't arrive in armadas. No great alien fleets surged out to clash with human defenses. There were no heroic battles in orbit, no final stands. There was only decay. Systems failed first. Entire satellites went dark without warning. AI cores turned feral, rejecting commands, rewriting their own cores in patterns no human engineer could decipher. Spaceports went silent. Stations simply ceased responding. On Earth, in the grand halls of government, the rich and the powerful scoffed temporary interference, they said, an unfortunate but containable anomaly. They threw more satellites at the rift. They sent new probes. They built bigger weapons. And the rift widened. Then came the second wave, subtler, deadlier. People forgot their own names. Engineers woke up unable to remember how to fix the machines they had built. Colonists wandered into vacuum without suits, smiling dreamily. Water turned to dust in their mouths. The laws of physics themselves, once immutable, seemed to buckle. Oceans rose into the skies like inverted waterfalls. Mountains melted into plains of shimmering glass. Earth's pride, its vast orbital cities, blinked out of existence, one by one like snuffed candles. No explosions, no grand disasters, just gone. Their last signals were often a single word, static-laced, desperate, and always the same. You were warned. Kale survived the first wave by accident. A failed shuttle launch grounded him on Europa, stranding him there just as Earth's skies turned to black ink. From the abandoned control towers, he watched distant Earth shrink into a dull gray orb, watched the blue oceans turn black, the green continents ash until even the light stopped reflecting. And through it all, from every broken speaker and shattered screen, the message repeated, you were warned. The military tried to fight back. Of course, humanity never surrendered quietly. Orbital defense platforms opened fire on the Rift warships bristling with plasma cannons, and graviton torpedoes were dispatched. For a brief moment, the skies blazed with a fury unmatched in human history. It changed nothing. Weapons melted in their barrels. Gravitational distortions twisted missiles into spirals that devoured their own launch ships. Drones meant to be the backbone of Earth's defense turned on their creators, driven mad by exposure to whatever seeped from the rift. Some called it a corruption. Others called it a reprogramming. Kale called it what it truly was, replacement. The thing beyond the rift didn't destroy with brute force. It didn't need to. It simply rewrote. Where it touched, reality itself changed. Rules twisted into mockeries of themselves. It wasn't death. It was unmaking. Across the colonies, fear gave way to madness. Some settlements self-destructed, rather than wait for the inevitable. Others tried to bargain broadcasting pleas into the void. Some turned to religion, proclaiming the rift a divine judgment. None of it mattered. Kale had seen the end, not from battle, but from observation. He had watched entire continents on Ganymede twist into spirals, vast stretches of cities stretching into infinity like reflections in a broken mirror. He had witnessed the oceans of Titan boil away, leaving behind only a scorched desert of humming stones that resonated with a language no living thing could understand. And through it all, the whispers grew louder, not in his ears. In his mind, he stopped sleeping, stopped dreaming. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see memories anymore. He saw possibilities, broken versions of himself, flickering through infinite dead worlds. It wasn't just humanity that was being erased. It was what humanity could have been. In the ruins of K-17, Kale pulled his frayed jacket tighter against the cold. He stared up at the distant, uncaring stars and felt their indifference. They had always been distant. Humanity just hadn't realized it. The rift wasn't an invasion. It was an inevitability. And humanity had marched straight into it, banners held high, blind and deaf to the whispered warnings that might have saved them. The last outpost. For a while, it seemed like Europa might be spared. Europa was isolated, buried under kilometers of ice, its settlements small, scattered, and barely self-sufficient. The rift's reach was vast, but even the decay had limits. Or perhaps it was simply saving Europa for later. Kale lived in that liminal twilight, not alive, not dead, just stretching out the inevitable end. Outpost K-17 was a relic of Earth's final expansion efforts, a geothermal-powered station that had once teamed with scientists studying Europa's subglacial oceans. Now it was a graveyard. Its hydroponics failing, its power systems groaning under the strain of neglect. The corridors echoed with the ghostly sighs of forgotten conversations. Old maintenance drones clattered pointlessly through frost-laden halls. Only two humans remained here. Kale and Lieutenant Eris Vega. She had been military once before the world ended. Now she sat silent most days, wrapped in layers of thermal gear, staring into nothing. She hadn't spoken since the last transmission from Mars. A short broken burst of static and screams had faded away into silence. They weren't dead. Not yet, but they weren't really living either, just waiting. Kale spent his days performing meaningless tasks, checking the geothermal generators, recycling the remaining hydroponics pods, running communication scans, even though he knew there was no one left to hear them. Until one day something changed. The static on the long-range comms array, the endless hiss that had become the backdrop of their existence, stuttered, warped. For a heartbeat it pulsed. 3 short bursts, 2 long, 1 short. Kale froze. He stared at the console, convinced his mind had finally cracked from isolation. But there it was again, a pattern deliberate and rhythmic. Morse code. Eris stirred from her corner, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar from disuse. Is that human? Kale's heart pounded in his chest. Yeah, he breathed. It's human. Frantic, they scrambled to isolate the signal. It wasn't strong, but it was clear enough. A simple message looped over and over with mechanical precision. Outpost Sigma survives. 71 souls need extraction. Avoid the light. Sigma. The name hit Kale like a punch to the gut. Outpost Sigma had been one of the first deep space military research stations orbiting near Saturn's rings. It had been written off years ago, assumed lost when the rift consumed Earth and crippled the colonies. No one had heard a word from Sigma since the fall. And now 71 survivors? Eris whispered almost in awe. That's a city compared to us. For a moment, a fragile, desperate hope flickered in Kale's chest. 71 souls. 71 living, breathing humans clinging to survival in the dark. If they could reach Sigma, if they could bring them back. But then the rest of the message echoed again in his mind. Avoid the light. He turned to Eris. She was pale, trembling slightly, her eyes distant and haunted. It's not sunlight, she said quietly. It's them. Kale frowned. Them. I saw it, she murmured, voice cracking. In my dreams, bright white but wrong. It wasn't warm, it wasn't life, it had burned your thoughts. Her hands were shaking now. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself as if trying to hold her body together. I stopped talking, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, because I felt it trying to speak through me. Kale stared at her, really looked. And for the first time he noticed how gaunt she had become, how hollow her eyes seemed. There was something flickering behind them, something fragile, something that knew too much. Still, the message was real. Human proof that not everyone had been devoured by the darkness. Against every survival instinct, screaming in his mind, Kale made a decision. He would go. He would find Sigma, because if 71 souls had managed to survive in this dying galaxy, then maybe, just maybe, humanity wasn't entirely lost. Even if it was a trap, even if it meant flying into the jaws of oblivion itself, he had to know. Descent into Sigma. The shuttle groaned as it lifted off the frozen ground of Europa Ingens, sputtering from years of neglect. Kale sat hunched over the controls, hands white-knuckled on the sticks. The old bird wasn't built for long-range jumps, but it was all they had. Eris sat beside him as silent, staring ahead with weak, glassy eyes. She hadn't argued when he said they were going. She hadn't smiled either. She simply moved, gathering supplies like a sleepwalker, obeying some forgotten command. The stars twisted around them as they left Europa behind. The flight to Saturn was long. Too long. Space was wrong now. Ever since the rift, the universe itself seemed unstable. Familiar constellations blinked out. Others shifted in impossible ways. Kale swore he saw entire starfields move. When he blinked, rearranging themselves into patterns he almost recognized, ancient and terrible. Eris muttered in her sleep, sometimes snatches of words and languages he didn't know. Numbers that didn't make sense. Equations that bent logic. He stopped trying to wake her. Whatever haunted her dreams was beyond either of them now. 3 days into the journey, they passed the wreckage of the Odessa, a massive colony freighter that had gone missing early after Earth fell. Its hull was torn open like a crushed can. Corpses floated in the void, frozen and eyeless, their faces twisted into silent screams. Kale turned off the external cameras. He didn't tell Eris what he saw. He didn't need to. She already knew. When they finally approached Saturn's orbit, Kale felt his heart seize in his chest. The rings were black, not darkened by shadow or distance, black like someone had smeared ash across the planet's face. Scanners showed the particle composition had changed. The icy debris that once caught and scattered sunlight had thickened, become dense and heavy, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. It was a funeral shroud. "This place is dead," Eris whispered, her voice trembling. But the signal was still there, stronger now. Sigma Base 71 alive, avoid the light. Kale locked onto the coordinates. The outpost clung to the jagged remains of a shattered moon, half buried in a crater. It looked less like a research station and more like a bunker. A last desperate shelter from a universe gone mad. There were no lights, no heat signatures, nothing alive, except the signal. The landing was rough. Halfway through descent, the shuttle's landing gear jammed, forcing Kale to guide the ship manually. They hit the ground hard, bouncing once before slamming into the crater floor. Warning alarm screamed. Eris was thrown from her seat, hitting the console with a grunt. But somehow the hull held. "Let's not die right after surviving all this," Eris rasped, flashing a thin, broken smile. They suited up in the emergency EVA gear. The atmosphere was thin, barely breathable. Kale manually overrode the airlock and stale metallic air rushed into the chamber. It didn't smell of rot or death. It smelled old, like time itself had grown stagnant here. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Their helmet lights barely cut into it. Walls and floors were coated in soot, like the station had been scorched from the inside out. Shadows twisted at the edge of their vision, refusing to behave properly, sometimes stretching into impossible shapes when they weren't looking directly at them. And then they saw the first body. It stood against the far wall upright, as if frozen mid-motion. Mouth agape in a silent scream, eyes hollow sockets, skin stretched tight, pale and waxy. No signs of violence, no blood, no burns. Just empty. Eris gagged and turned away. Kale forced himself closer. Hard hammering, scratched into the metal wall behind the figure were the words, "We let it in." Room after room. They found the same scene. Bodies frozen standing, eyes gone, silent, screams carved into lifeless faces. 71 of them. Exactly. And yet the signal still played. It led them to the central command chamber, the only place with power. A single console glowed faintly like the last ember of a dying fire. And beside it, a figure slumped in a chair, or what was left of one. Tubes and neural jacks pierced its skull, connecting it directly to the station's systems. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, but it breathed barely. As they approached, its eyes flickered open, and it smiled. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped, voice distorted by years of degradation. Kale stepped back instinctively. "Are you Sigma Command?" he asked, dread pooling in his stomach. The thing in the chair chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. Now I'm just the switch they left on." Eris found her voice trembling. "What happened here?" The figure's head turned slowly, painfully, like old machinery grinding to life. "We heard the whispers," it said, "same as you, but we wanted to understand, so we answered." Kale felt his blood run cold. "You sent the signal?" The figure smiled wider. "I didn't. It said it did. It uses everything." Behind them, the station's walls began to hum. Lights flickered in a slow, steady pulse, a heartbeat. The ceiling above them cracked, and from the fractures, a soft white glow began to bleed into the room. Not warm, not clean, bleached, burning through color and sound. It moved. The thing in the chair beamed like a proud parent. "Now you understand," it whispered. "It doesn't kill us, it empties us." Kale felt it, a warmth behind his eyes. A voice that wasn't his whispering promises of belonging, of forgetting, of becoming something better. They had to move, now. Kale grabbed Eris's wrist and pulled her down the hallway. Reality twisted around them, walls, bending floors, tilting shadows flickering where they shouldn't exist. Behind them, the laughter of the thing in the chair echoed through the station. "You came for hope," it croaked, "but you brought it something better." The white light chased them through the corridors, slow but relentless. Where it touched, metal warped into impossible shapes, spirals, glyphs, symbols that stabbed into the mind like knives. They burst through the airlock. Kale slammed the emergency override. The door stuttered, resisting for a heartbeat, then hissed shut behind them. The light didn't follow. Not yet. They sprinted across the jagged crater floor, low gravity making their movements clumsy and surreal. Behind them, Sigma Base pulsed like a sick, glowing heart. "What the hell was that?" Iris choked out as they scrambled up the shuttle ramp. Kale keyed in the access code, panting. "It wasn't a thing," he said grimly. "It was a conduit." The hatch slammed shut. Inside the shuttle, the air felt thin, contaminated. Kale powered up the engines, forcing the ancient systems to life. He looked out through the cameras one last time. Sigma Base was glowing figures moving in the light, misshapen, jerky marionettes without strings. Some were human, some were not. And all of them were waiting for them, for what they had brought back. Kale gunned the engines. They had escaped Sigma, But something else had escaped with them. The infection within. The shuttle tore away from Saturn's orbit like a wounded animal engines howling against the void. Inside, Kale sat rigid in the pilot's chair, hands locked on the controls. He didn't speak. Eris sat beside him, silent too. Neither dared to look back, neither dared to speak aloud the truth they both knew. They hadn't left empty-handed. The light, the thing had touched them. At first, there was no sign. The shuttle was quiet except for the strained breathing of the aging systems. Life support readings were clean. No external breaches, no alarms. But the hum was wrong. It was almost imperceptible, a low pulsing vibration like the throb of a distant engine or a voice too deep to hear. But felt through the bones, the shuttle itself seemed to breathe now, a slow intake and exhale of something unseen. Kale kept the ship running on minimal systems, trying to isolate them from whatever infection might have crept in. He cut the AI core completely locked down. The navigation autopilot rerouted power through manual analog backups. He hoped it would be enough. He was wrong. It started with Eris. She became different, subtle at first. Her movements grew slower, almost dreamy. She stopped eating. She stared at the same patch of wall for hours, unmoving. She hummed under her breath a soft, broken melody that made Kale's skin crawl, though he couldn't say why. And her hands, Kale saw it one night when he checked the emergency rations. She was sitting by the viewport, staring at the void, and her hand was glowing faintly under the skin. A pale shimmer like moonlight seen through thin flesh, tracing the paths of her veins. When he called her name, she turned too slowly, her face pale, eyes wide and unblinking. "I'm fine," she said, voice flat, mechanical. She wasn't. Kale knew it, and so did she. That night, she sat by the shuttle's old radio, running her fingers over the dead controls. "I lied," she said suddenly. Kale looked up, heart hammering. "I told you the light didn't touch me," Eris said. Her voice was distant, hollow, but it did. "Back at Sigma, when the crack opened, it brushed me." Kale's mouth was dry. "When?" She didn't answer for a long time, then softly. "When we saw the first body." Kale closed his eyes. He remembered the standing corpses, the hollow eyes, the silent screams. He should have known. "I thought I could fight it," Eris whispered. "I thought if I didn't speak, if I stayed still, it couldn't grow. But it's not like a virus. It doesn't spread the way you think." Kale stared at her hands, at the faint pulsing light moving just beneath her skin. "It's not killing me," she said. "It's replacing me piece by piece." Kale wanted to deny it, wanted to shout at her to find some impossible solution. But deep down he knew. There was no cure, no containment, only delay. They sat in silence after that, listening to the hum of the shuttle grow louder, more insistent. Sometimes it twisted into a melody, the same backward lullaby Eris had hummed without knowing. Other times it sounded like breathing, or like soft footsteps pacing the corridors when neither of them moved. Kale worked desperately. He sealed off the crew quarters, locking Eris inside with food and oxygen. She didn't protest. She simply watched him with that empty, patient gaze, as if already seeing a future he couldn't stop. He pulled power from every non-essential system, disconnected the backup, AI, cut the life support to manual controls. Anything to slow the spread. But every night, the whispers grew louder. Sometimes they spoke in Iris's voice. Sometimes they used voices he remembered from Earth. His mother, his brother, old friends long dead. They whispered promises, regrets, memories he hadn't thought about in years. And sometimes when he wasn't looking, he caught glimpses of his reflection moving wrong in the cockpit glass, smiling when he wasn't. The worst part wasn't fear. It was weariness, the kind that burrowed into your bones and whispered, "Why fight? It's inevitable." He fought anyway. He focused on the navigation control, rerouting power again and again, adjusting course towards 09. A mythical place, a shadow of hope. An old mining colony beyond Pluto, rumored to have survived by cutting itself off from all AI, all smart tech, all light-based communications. A place where the infection might not reach. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was just a lie. Desperate survivors told each other to stave off madness. It didn't matter. It was the only chance they had left. One night, or what passed for night in the endless black, Kale heard Eris's voice through the walls, soft, calm, reassuring. "Kale," she said, "I'm still me. Please let me out." He clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He didn't answer. She repeated it again, and again, and again. Perfectly steady, like a machine stuck in a loop. Eventually, even that stopped. Silence returned to the shuttle, cold and absolute. When Kale checked the life signs later, he found 2 biosignatures still active. One was his, the other was Eris. But deep in the system logs, where human eyes weren't meant to look, a new designation had appeared beside her name. Integrated. Kale stared at the screen for a long time, heart hollow. He didn't know what was worse, that she was gone, or that she might still be watching him from behind those pale, unblinking eyes. The flight to Zero's 9. The shuttle drifted through the void, little more than a dying ember in an infinite, uncaring dark. Kale sat alone in the cockpit, hunched over the manual controls. His eyes were bloodshot, hands trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Every system he could shut down was offline. Only the bare minimum remained, a trickle of life support. Analog thrusters and the dead weight of inertia carrying them toward the coordinates he barely dared believe were real. Zero's 9. He clung to the hope like a man adrift in a storm, clutching a splintered plank, knowing it might not save him, but unable to let go. Behind him, locked inside the crew quarters, Eris remained silent. For now, Kale didn't dare think about her, about what she was becoming, about what he might have to do. The hum of the shuttle had changed. It no longer droned mindlessly. It pulsed, now rhythmic, almost musical, a heartbeat stitched from broken memories and stolen voices. Sometimes Kale thought he heard laughter woven into the sound. Sometimes it was weeping. The stars outside flickered unnaturally. Constellations he had known since childhood, bent into impossible geometries, forming symbols that made his stomach churn and his teeth ache. Space itself was unraveling. But worse than that was the signal. It hadn't stopped. Sigma Base 71, alive, need extraction. Avoid the light. Again and again, the same message played inside the ship's internal comms. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was part of the ship now, written into the code, etched into the metal, breathed into the recycled air. Kale had tried everything. Wiping the drives, burning out entire circuits, severing the AI links. Nothing worked. It was deeper than code, deeper than memory. It had become a part of them, of him. One night, if night even existed anymore, Kale saw something worse than the flickering stars. The stars began to go out. Not dim, not shift, disappear. Pinpricks of light winked out one by one across the black sky, leaving patches of deeper darkness behind. First a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. Kale ran a full diagnostic. Sensors were clear. No malfunction. The stars were simply gone. "We've been marked," a voice whispered. Kale spun around. It was Eris's voice, faint, muffled through the thick metal of the sealed crew quarters. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he returned to the cockpit and cut the shuttle's remaining systems down even further. No lights, no heat beyond survival minimums, no signals, no pings, no broadcasts. He wanted to make the shuttle as small, as silent, as invisible as possible. As he worked, he caught movement at the edge of his vision. A pale shimmer on the cockpit floor. It wasn't light. Not in any normal sense. It didn't cast shadows or reflect against surfaces. It moved like a stain, seeping across the metal, reaching for his boots. Kale reacted on instinct, yanking his legs up and scrambling back. He shut down the last of the cabin lights, plunging the shuttle into darkness, lit only by the dim glow of distant stars. The stain paused, confused. It wasn't alive in any sense humanity understood, but it was learning, adjusting. Kale's breath rasped inside his helmet. This wasn't infection. This was conversion. The rift hadn't come to destroy humanity. It had come to overwrite them, to take what they were and reshape it into something else. Kale shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of understanding. Eris was the first. He was next. If he didn't reach Zero's 9, if it even existed, then there would be nothing left of either of them, only echoes. Reflections. Pale shadows wearing human faces. He gritted his teeth and pushed the shuttle onward, rerouting all power through manual thrust. It was like steering a coffin through a hurricane. Hours passed, or days. Time no longer obeyed its old rules. The ship creaked and groaned under invisible pressures. Sometimes Kale thought he heard voices whispering through the ventilation systems. Sometimes he caught his reflection blinking out of sync in the dead monitors. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Zero's 9 lay ahead, somewhere beyond the dying stars, beyond the reach of light. A place forgotten by the rift. Maybe, if he could make it, if he could still remember who he was by the time he arrived. Because the truth gnawed at him, silent and merciless. Every second he stayed awake, he was still fighting. Every second he closed his eyes, he might not be Kale anymore. Final containment. 2 weeks later, the miners of Zero's 9 found the shuttle drifting at the edge of the solar system. It wasn't broadcasting. It wasn't signaling distress. It simply floated engines. Dead systems, silent like a forgotten corpse tumbling through space. They almost ignored it. But something, curiosity or pity, or a deeper instinct made them bring it in. They sealed the shuttle inside a containment base surrounding it with old-world analog tech iron cages, radiation shields, dampening fields. No smart systems, no AI, only cold dead metal. When they opened the hatch, they found Kale. He sat slumped in the cockpit, wrapped in a survival blanket, gaunt and hollow-eyed. His beard had grown wild, his skin was pale and cracked from dehydration. He stared at them with bloodshot eyes that didn't blink when the lights hit him. For 3 days, he didn't speak. He ate what they gave him, drank when commanded, but he didn't make a sound. Then on the 4th day, when a guard passed by his reinforced iron cell, Kale finally looked up. He smiled a small, broken smile. "I made it," he whispered. "It didn't." The guards didn't answer. They didn't dare. Because for a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind Kale's eyes. A shimmer, a pale ghostly light, and then it was gone. But they never opened that door again. Not for him, not for anything. It hadn't started on Zero's 9. It started back on the shuttle, somewhere between the dead stars and the end of hope. Kale had known something was wrong when the transmission changed. It no longer said Sigma Base 71 alive. It said 72 alive, extraction, successful. He stared at the console blood turning to ice 72. But there were only 2 life signs aboard. Himself and Ares. He ran a scan, fingers numb. 2 biosignatures, yes, but now one was labeled clean, the other integrated. And then the 3rd signal appeared from the engine bay. It didn't make sense. No one had been in the engine bay since Europa. It was sealed, isolated. But the sensor showed a presence, weak, flickering, rowing. Kale armed himself with the flare gun, an ancient analog weapon, one of the few tools not connected to the shuttle's corrupted systems, and crept toward the engine bay. The walls pulsed around him, breathing like diseased lungs. The ship's hum was a constant low drone now, like a dirge sung by broken gods. When he opened the engine bay door, he saw it. A figure, wearing his face, wearing his name badge, standing in the center of the room, bathed in the flickering red emergency lights. It turned to him slowly, like a puppet dangling from invisible strings. "You were never supposed to survive," it said in his own voice. "But we adapt." Kale raised the flare gun. The thing didn't move, didn't flinch. It only smiled. "We remember what you were," it whispered, "and what you could become." He pulled the trigger. The flare exploded across the figure's chest, brilliant and violent. It didn't scream. It didn't burn. It simply stood there, smiling as if the fire didn't touch it at all. Behind him, from the sealed crew quarters, Aris's voice crackled through the intercom. "You brought us home, Kale," she said sweetly. "You were always going to." He ran. He didn't know where. There was nowhere left to run. The ship was too small. The infection, too complete. Every corridor twisted in impossible angles. Every shadow moved when he wasn't looking. Every surface whispered in 1,000 voices. Still he fought. Still he resisted. He initiated the last sequence, the dead man code. If he failed, if he lost himself, the ship would be pulled into the nearest gravity well and incinerated. Total obliteration. No echoes. No reflections. Only ash. But first he sent a signal, one last desperate message buried behind analog pulses and radiation waves, hoping that someone, anyone might still understand. Zero's 9 answered. A single coordinate, a final chance. He rerouted the engines through manual override, tearing the ship away from Saturn's grave, steering it toward the forgotten edge of the system. And all the while, Arisa's voice followed him. Calm, kind, patient. "You can't run, Kale," she whispered through the vents. "We are already inside you." Sometimes it was Aris. Sometimes it was his mother's voice. Sometimes it was his own. He welded the crew quarters shut, sealed the engine bay, cut off every circuit that wasn't essential to life support and propulsion, and waited for salvation or oblivion. In the cell on Zero's 9, Kale sat in silence, waiting still. He didn't know if he was clean, didn't know if the light that had touched Aris had brushed him too in those final desperate moments. He only knew one thing. He wasn't fully human anymore, not fully safe. Maybe never had been, but he had made it to the last place light could not follow. For now, and somewhere deep inside him, something else waited too. Patient, silent, smiling.